Thank you very much, Megan, for that wonderful introduction. But before I begin, I want to do some further thanking of my own. I'd like to acknowledge the collaborative efforts and old-fashioned hard work of the team at the Frist. I'd like to begin by thanking Director Susan Edwards for both her initial interest in the project and her successful efforts in bringing on board the other venues which made this U.S. tour possible. And these venues were the Minneapolis Institute of Art and the Portland Art Museum in Oregon. I'd also like to thank Chief Curator Mark Scala for his support and Curator Trinita Kennedy for her unflagging efforts in realizing the exhibition here at the Frist. Thanks also go to exhibition designer Hans Schmidt-Matzen, whose attention to detail and professionalism resulted in the seamless translation of this project into the Frist's own beautiful galleries. Lead technician Scott Tom, along with all the members of the installation and exhibitions teams, ensured the smooth running of so many aspects of this installation. I'm also grateful for the contributions of the registrar's team, along with the efforts of marketing director Kathy de Monbrin and her colleague Wallace Joyner, as well as media and PR director Buddy Kite. Thank you also again to Megan and to Ginny Sonskin for all of their help. And now we're going to look at some beautiful images about Italian fashion. So I'm absolutely delighted that you're all able to give up your Friday evenings to join me here tonight. And the aim of this talk is to give you a little sneak peek behind the scenes of what you're going to see when you go into the exhibition. But first, I'd like to set the exhibition a little bit in context and answer the questions of why Italian fashion and why the V&A. So to start with, I think we have to go back many years ago to some Stanfill family trips. As you can probably tell from my accent, I'm not British, even though I work at a British national institution. I'm in fact from Alaska. And in order to combat this bad luck, my father and mother, Stan and Silver, made every effort to bring us to Europe at every opportunity. And so in fact, I spent quite a few vacations and holidays on the streets of Rome and Florence and Milan, noticing the difference between what people wore there and on the streets of Anchorage. And so the seed was planted, helped of course by visits to Italian art museums, which led to a BA, as you heard earlier, in art history, and also a master's degree in the history of fashion. And ever since I received that degree in history of fashion, I've been asking myself the question, why hasn't there been a major exhibition looking at Italian style? And in fact, there is this surprising feature of the Italian cultural landscape that there is no national collection of fashion in Italy, nor is there a collection of design in a national Italian museum. So this gave the V&A a unique opportunity to propose and deliver an exhibition devoted to Italian style. The image that you see on the screen, for me, sums up very nicely the sense of joie de vivre and this kind of careless, easy elegance that infuses so many of the designs that you're going to see within the exhibition. It's in fact a photograph from 1985 of an advertisement for the Italian designer Gianfranco Ferre, whose work you'll also see in the show. And I'd like you to keep this image in mind as we look at some of the further examples within the show. But as the title suggests, we start at the end of the Second World War. And as this image will convey, Italy, like much of the rest of Europe, was both physically and economically devastated at the war's end. And it's hard to imagine, looking at that photograph, that in just a few years' time, Italy will become one of the leading sources of fashion design in the world. During the war, the Italian government actually tried to regulate fashion production. It was necessary, of course, to limit the use of fabrics and materials for the war effort. But they also tried to control what they called a sense of Italianness in design. I'm not quite sure what that meant, but I think Mussolini had an idea. And one of the things that one of the elements that he instituted in this program was something called the Marca di Garanzia, the mark of guarantee, which was a kind of award given to producers of garments when they met his restrictions. And that, you can see a photograph just to the right of one of those marks. And it's a little label that producers could sew into their garments. There is, in fact, one of these marks inside a dress on display as you first enter the galleries. It's a very rare surviving example because, not surprisingly, the Italians weren't particularly organized in implementing this program, and so very few marks of guarantee survive. But we move very quickly on from the war's end to a different moment, a moment when glamour exploded onto the international scene, gowns created by Italian designers. And this is a part of the story that I, as an American, find very interesting because the North American market was crucial for the development of an Italian fashion industry. And in fact, the American government, through the Marshall Plan, ensured that Italian textile factories were heavily subsidized so that they could grow and expand after the war. The United States needed Italy as a viable trading partner, and they also needed to help Italy rehabilitate its reputation after so many years of fascist rule. And after many weeks of research within several archives in Italy, I've found documents from the US government that talk directly about promoting this nascent fashion industry in Italy. Some of the things that I wanted to point out were that, in fact, the first fashion shows that were internationally attended in Italy took place in Florence. We often think of Milan now as the fashion capital, but in 1951, one gentleman, Mr. Giovanni Battista Giorgini, held the first fashion show in Italy to which international buyers and press came. The first fashion show was in his living room, attended by only a dozen people, but they were deeply influential and included a member of the press corps of Women's Wear Daily, as well as buyers from Bergdorf Goodman and B. Altman, among others. The next event of note after the one in Giorgini's house took place in a much larger room. And you'll see a photograph of this here. This is the so-called Sala Bianca in Palazzo Pitti in Florence, just south of the Arno. And he secured the use of this glamorous hall through his many connections. Before the war, he had been a buying agent for US department stores, and he helped them to import Italian handicrafts. After the war, he used all of these connections to convince these same people to come to Florence and see these fashion shows. The Sala Bianca, or White Hall, in Palazzo Pitti, as you can see from the image, is a very glamorous room. It's chandelier bedecked. Those are Murano glass chandeliers. It's a very, very grand space and beautiful backdrop against which to show these glamorous gowns. And so, very quickly, the guest list grew from just a handful really, to several hundred, to by 1955, over 500 guests came to attend the shows. The thing, too, that he was able to achieve, not only securing the use of this grand hall and convincing buyers and press to come, was that he convinced the Italian designers from all across Italy to come to one place and show. Because, of course, there were designers not just in Florence, but also in Milan and Rome, and he was able to get them to look past their regional differences and come to one place to show. And this makes me remember the sense of regional suspicion the Italians have of a conversation that I had in a taxi cab in Rome, where the taxi cab driver was talking about his suspicion of the people from Naples, and he said, "Yes, after I shake the hand of someone from Naples, I count how many fingers I have." So this is no mean feat on the part of Giorgini that he brought everyone to one place. And here you see a photograph of the great man himself on the far left and some of the models showcasing designs. But really, the thing to remember, too, is that these designs, for the most part, they were cocktail dresses and evening gowns. But the Italians set themselves apart by showing sportswear. A designer like Pucci, for example, would have showed ski wear and beach wear amongst some of the gowns by the other designers. So they were offering a whole wardrobe that the American market accepted readily. I did a lot of the research for this portion of the exhibition in this very unassuming looking building. It's the State Archives in Florence where the Giorgini papers are held, and it's a fascinating process to gain access to a building like this because it involves not just a lot of paperwork, but a lot of coffee drinking with people to make sure they think that you're okay. And there I discovered documents like this, which is one of the guest lists for the 1955 event. And I don't know if those of you in the back can see, but what was so exciting for me was to read some of the names on this list, which include the great department stores across the United States: B. Altman, Filene's, Macy's, I. Magnin in San Francisco, and many others, as well as the stores across Europe. And so what we have here is really a who's who's list of the filters of taste for the North American market, because these buyers, now long forgotten, but were really the conduits through which the choice and style of North American women were created. Just to give you a bit of additional kind of context, in this slide you'll see photographs of that very first show in 1951 in Giorgini's living room. And you can see that the models are just kind of walking around, a group of women seated in chairs. But the photograph on the right shows Giorgini's daughter Matilda with one of the buyers from Morgan's department store in Montreal, Henry Nixon. And Henry is seated with Matilda in a way that suggests that perhaps their alliance is more than just professional. And after conversations with the grandson, I can confirm that they had a dalliance. But then also, one of the programs is shown below. And the thing that Giorgini did so creatively was that he ensured that his guests had a fabulous time. There were suppers, there were dances, there were all kinds of entertainments. And so they were really the kind of prototype of what we think of as a fashion week. Catwalk shows interspersed with all sorts of other attractions. I mentioned sportswear earlier, and here you see a sampling of a Pucci blouse on the catwalk, and in our conservation studio, the same blouse before it went on display. And there is John Nixon again, with his little bow tie in the background, seated next to Julia Trissel, the buyer for Bergdorf Goodman. And you can see that these are designs that really weren't always about the highest level of couture. There was a sportswear option available. We then move on to a part of the exhibition that talks about a different type of clothing. This is clothing made for one woman by a dressmaker. A dressmaker in Italy is called a sartoria, and a sartoria has a kind of lower level, if you like, of a reputation. She probably doesn't have a designer label in her garments. She has a small atelier of seamstresses, and she's servicing a very local clientele who develop a relationship with her over the years and who trust her to create wardrobes that are both stylish but also adapted to the client's figure and taste. In this case, the client is Mrs. Werner Abegg. There's a photo of her on the left. By all reports, she was a woman of good humor. And she also had very sort of specific ideas about how she wanted to dress. She was married to the textile and art collector, Werner Abegg, who also had a cotton finishing plant in Turin where they lived. Mrs. Abegg could have afforded the best of French couture, but she chose to buy local, and she went to the dressmaker Maria Grimaldi to have her suits and evening gowns made. And here is a detail of one of those pieces. It's a day coat, and you can perhaps just make out the very meticulous seaming on the back of the coat. And in the gallery, we've been able to open up one of her suit jackets and lay it flat so that you can see the lining is as impeccably tailored as the exterior. Maria Grimaldi did not have a designer label, but she did have a maker's mark. It's a kind of spray of flowers that she stitched into the waistbands of some of her clothes. And it was a very, really modest affair. But we also have, in addition to Maria Grimaldi's designs for Mrs. Abegg, a group of accessories that sort of fill out the wardrobe. We then move on to a very different subject entirely. Looking back at that group of modest garments made by a dressmaker, it does give you a sense of the quality of the handmade available across the country at the war's end and into the 1950s. But there was another phenomenon brewing, and that is the so-called Hollywood on the Tiber moment, when so many Hollywood films were shot on location in Rome in their Cinecittà studios. The Italian government actively encouraged the Hollywood producers to film there through subsidies and through tax breaks. And so this helped to bring more and more productions to that city. Within the galleries, you'll see some wonderful film clips from Roman Holiday and also War and Peace and La Dolce Vita. These images created a kind of glamorous backdrop against which Italian style developed, as well as the phenomenon of so many Hollywood celebrities descending on Rome and going shopping. So here you see a photograph of Audrey Hepburn shopping with Salvatore Ferragamo, choosing her shoes. Many other celebrities, of course, came to Florence, but also their holidays on the Amalfi Coast, their love affairs on and off set. This became the kind of gossip column's favorite target. But the result was that so many images of Italian designers being worn by these Hollywood stars were spread round the world, and it made a name for Italian style. Ava Gardner was one of the best clients for the so-called Sorelle Fontana, or Fontana sisters, whose atelier was just behind the Spanish Steps in Rome, a very convenient stopping point for going shopping. This gown, worn by Audrey Hepburn in the film War and Peace, is in the exhibition, and it was designed by the Roman couturier Gattinoni, which is still in business today. And this is one of my favorite pieces in the exhibition, so I'll urge you when you go into the galleries to stop and pay homage. It is a gown that was designed by the Milanese couturier Milachon, and despite her name, she was Italian, based in Milan, and she showed on the Sala Bianca catwalk for the first time in 1965. And by 1966, she was the go-to designer for some of the best-dressed women in the world. This gown was worn by Princess Lee Radziwill, the sister of Jacqueline Kennedy, to Truman Capote's black and white ball in 1966. And there you can see an image of her dancing with Truman. She's having a marvelous time. I'm not so sure that he is. And what is remarkable to me, aside from the fact that this gown is just drop-dead glamorous, is the fact that we are in 1966, 15 years after that first fashion show in Giorgini's house in Florence, and we have a woman who is known for her French couture wardrobe choosing an Italian to dress her for the ball. So look how far Italian fashion has come since that first sparsely attended fashion show in Florence. And here's a photo of the couple on the dance floor. You can just see her with her arm bent, dancing with her husband. And some other examples of contributions by designers at this time included the Palazzo pajamas by Galitzine. The First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy is known to have worn a similar ensemble while entertaining in the White House. And of course, the more typical designs of Emilio Pucci, whose ski wear and beach wear really suited, as I mentioned earlier, the American taste, but who also designed very fantastic sort of holiday wardrobes for the jet set. His kaleidoscopic prints really struck a chord for summer wardrobes. This is our fabulous Vespa, which is in the exhibition. I couldn't do an exhibition on Italian style without a Vespa. It was required. And this is a piece of fantastic design that we sourced from a collector in Britain who received it in bits, a kind of pile of scrap, and lovingly restored it over several years. And it's one of a few surviving examples that were first imported into Britain in 1949. So it really is a remarkable surviving piece. We have this delightful brooch as well, our only piece of jewelry in the exhibition, that was given to Elizabeth Taylor by Richard Burton. And of course, their love affair on the set of Cleopatra in Rome was notorious, but fueled by jewelry purchases. And in fact, Richard Burton is said of Elizabeth that the only word that she knew in Italian was Bulgari. And when the exhibition came to London, our sponsors happened to be Bulgari, so they were absolutely delighted with that quote, so we used it often. And we're not forgetting the men. We do have a group of beautifully tailored ensembles and suits in this next portion of the gallery, with examples of from design houses specializing both in bespoke suits as well as ready-to-wear examples. And it gives you a sense of some of the hallmarks of Italian menswear, particularly the bespoke suit, which tends to, in the case of this firm, Rubinacci, it provides a really interesting counterpoint to the English tailoring tradition, which until I started work on this project, I was much more familiar with. And the English jacket tends to have quite a bit of padding, almost like armor. And as one tailor put it, it gently corrects the defects of the wearer. But the Italians, they take out that padding, and as you probably know from thinking about the Armani suit, which became the kind of uniform of the 90s, the Italian suit jacket is often not only without padding, but in the case of Rubinacci, because of the Naples climate where they're based, they take out the lining. They take out the lining of the jacket as well to give it a more fluid drape. So these are some of the examples of tailoring on show. And then we move sort of through this very loose chronology into another portion of the exhibition, which is dealing with the subject of made in Italy. And of course, from the late 70s onwards, the Italian fashion story moves on from the handmade, the bespoke, the couture, and that trace of the hand to the factory. And when I say factory, I hope I'm not conjuring up images of mass fashion and mass-produced clothes, because the Italian factory was particularly adept at making clothing in multiples to a very high standard. And for this reason, by the 1980s, even clothes that were designed in Paris were probably made in Italy. Such was the skill of the Italian factory. And some of the designers that you'll see in this section are, I guess, what you might expect to see when you come to an exhibition about Italian fashion, those big names, the Versaces and Armanis, as well as perhaps some that were once very well known, but perhaps now slightly forgotten, like the House of Krizia, as you see here. This is one of my other favorite pieces in the exhibition. I am a child of the 1980s, and those shoulder pads speak to me. This is a Gianni Versace ensemble from 1985, and what's remarkable to me is that this is a piece that he gave the V&A to represent his own legacy as a designer. He donated it the year after it was made, and it represents how he saw himself. And it uses some of the finest quality materials available, beautiful wools and leather, as well as including all of the accessories, the hat, the jewelry, and the shoes, and some of those pieces we've been able to show with the garment. The jacket, the wool of the jacket, is made by a textile firm in Prato called Faliero Sarti. And I went to that factory. They have an archive, and Mr. Sarti remembers Versace coming to the factory himself to choose the fabric. He didn't send an assistant. He didn't send his associate. He came on his own, spoke to Mr. Sarti, and didn't like any of the houndstooth check Mr. Sarti offered. He wanted something bigger, and he wanted it in classic black and white. So those were made for Mr. Versace to order. And we've showed the swatch from that conversation next to this group in the gallery. Speaking of textiles, we also want to remember the fact that even though ready-to-wear by the mid-'80s had become the new fashion language, there were still Italian designers like Franco Ferre, who were creating beautiful couture pieces, such as this evening cape, which if you look at it very closely in the gallery, you'll see that the surface embroidery comes out in a three-dimensional, almost sculptural way. It's absolutely a tour de force of couture technique. We've also got examples from the very witty Franco Moschino. This Yellow Pages jacket is one of my favorites. And, of course, other examples from Gianni Versace, as well as knitwear. Knitwear became one of the key drivers of Italian exports from the 1980s onwards, and it includes examples from, of course, the House of Missoni and some wittier examples from the House of Krizia. We also have a spotlight within the galleries on leather and fur, two materials that are notoriously difficult to work with, and there's a lot to say about leather goods, but I'll focus for the moment on fur, particularly the House of Fendi, which under the direction of Karl Lagerfeld has really made remarkable strides in all kinds of experiments with fur-making techniques. And you see an example here from the early 2000s, which looks like wool, but in fact it's sheared mink. And each of those little shapes are individual pieces that have been stitched to the one next to it in a kind of jigsaw puzzle technique. So we close in on the final room of the gallery, in the sense that we are really coming up to the last decade of our story. And we started in the post-war period, meandered through the early decades of couture and the handmade with a bit of bespoke tailoring thrown in, and then we've quickly raced through what I call the go-go years of Italian fashion, the 1980s, when Italian designers could do no wrong and made in Italy became the mark of style. So what's really been happening over the last decade and a half? Well, it's had to do with Italian designers being at the forefront of designers becoming mega brands, of fashion designers also becoming, in some cases, more famous than the clients that they dress. And if you think of some of the major figures like Miuccia Prada or Mr. Armani or the DolceGabbana designers, you start to imagine that these are individuals who now no longer just design clothes. They design an ever-expanding universe of goods that includes bedding, hotel interiors, yacht interiors, all sorts of things that a fashion designer a decade and a half ago perhaps would never have thought to turn their hand to. And some of them become their design house's own best model. In particular, the case of Tom Ford for Gucci, a dashingly handsome gentleman who often was photographed wearing the Gucci clothes when he was at the helm. And of course, his work with fashion photographers and advertisements such as this on the screen helped to promote Gucci and turn the brand around in a really dramatic way. This is a portion of the exhibition where you'll also see some familiar names. Of course, Miuccia Prada is chief among them, and we have not just garments but also accessories, because of course bags and shoes are now today the driver of the big brands. That's where they make their money, and that's where they focus a lot of their efforts. And this is an example of that. The House of Fendi, and their so-called baguette bag, has become a collector's item. Now, each year, each season, rendered in a variety of colors and shapes and materials, but always in a different iteration each season to give the wearer a reason to buy that next Fendi bag. Lots of sparkle on show for Nashville. We have some wonderful accessories in this section, including these boots by DolceGabbana and bags and other shoe designs for you to enjoy. I also wanted to ensure that in addition to the names that you will expect to see, there are some newcomers. And this is a designer named Fausto Puglisi, who's only been designing for about 5 years, but he's a designer already adopted by the likes of Madonna and Anna Della Russo. And he's working very hard to make a name for himself while still honoring the Made in Italy tradition. All aspects of his collections are made at a whole network of factories across the country, and he takes great delight each time one of his samples comes back from the factory. So he's really a name to watch. And if anyone from Nordstrom is here this evening, I hope that you're soon carrying him for Nashville, because I think he would do very well here. We've also got something from Mr. Armani from a more recent collection. This is a design from his Armani Prive line. And what's interesting about Italian fashion in the last decade is that it's no longer just the ready-to-wear designers carrying on with that tradition. Designers like Mr. Armani, who made their bread and butter from ready-to-wear collections, have now started to look at couture. And the Armani Prive line, which is the couture made-to-measure line, is now one of the go-to labels for celebrities for the red carpet. So if you look at the coverage of the Oscars or of the Cannes Film Festival, many celebrities choose Armani Prive over other design houses. DolceGabbana is also represented by this ready-to-wear ensemble as well as a couture gown, because they too, in recent years, have started to design a couture line. And this is one of the third favorites of mine, if I have to choose. This is a design by the House of Valentino. And I realize that I haven't mentioned Valentino yet, but there are many examples in the exhibition. And we wanted to bring the story up to date because, of course, Mr. Valentino, who long reigned supreme in Rome as the couturier of choice, about 8 years ago when he retired, the house appointed two relative unknowns to take over the helm. And those individuals are Maria Grazia Chiuri and Pier Paolo Piccioli. And they have done something really remarkable. They have been able to translate this fashion line, which is really so closely associated with one individual, and bring it into a new era and address it to a new audience. So they harness the best of the Valentino couture techniques, but they translate it and update it in a very fresh and sometimes surprising way. I've had the good fortune of going to the Valentino atelier, and this is an enterprise which still refers to the seamstresses as le ragazze, or the girls, even though their average age is about 70. And le ragazze have the most magical fingers, and they are able to create gowns like this, which actually do take weeks to make. And I particularly like this design because it's got the most beautiful textiles, but they incorporate the surprising elements of creatures from the natural world. There's a rhinoceros on her chest, and a seahorse. And so if you look closely when you go in the galleries, you'll see this very elegant but also very surprising piece. Now, we're going to end this evening with a mention of something that you'll encounter just before that final room. And this is a group of filmed interviews that I conducted over 6 months with protagonists from the industry today, because we wanted to bring within the four walls of the exhibition story the perspective of the individuals who are taking this industry into the future. And so we've spoken to a whole host of different protagonists. From on the far top left, that's Mr. Rubinacci, the Naples tailor. The gentleman in the center is a leather goods technician from the Gucci factory. On the far right corner is Mr. Jacopo Etro from the House of Etro. And below him is Mrs. Missoni, Angela Missoni, who's taken the Missoni house forward from her father. And then the two Valentino designers, Maria Grazia Chiuri and Pier Paolo Piccioli, followed by perhaps the most powerful woman in Italian fashion, Franco Sozzani, who is the editor of Italian Vogue. And these interviews, I hope, provide a somewhat more realistic picture of what the future of Italian fashion is about. There are challenges to face, including production in China, including high taxes, which everyone complains about, as well as some very sharp criticism of the Italian government. And so we didn't want to just celebrate the beauty of Italian fashion, but of course there's a lot to celebrate, but we wanted to bring this a series of commentaries on the future of Italian fashion into the exhibition to make it a bit more topical, and also to remind our visitor that these are the individuals that have to take the exhibition or take the future of Italian fashion into the next generation. So with that mention of the future, I think that's probably a good place to stop, but I think that we might have time for just a few questions, and I thank you for your kind attention. Thank you very much.